All right, there's a lot to cover, so I'm going to start.
And then, would you believe that they're still all recommending NC-17 movies?
You're all still recommending NC-17 movies to minors?
Every single team.
Every single team is recommending NC-17 movies to minors. Please stop recommending NC-17 movies to minors.
Here they're not doing anything unless they have points attached.
Why aren't there points attached? You'd think a little bit of social shaming. This problem is not hard to solve. It would take you like 10 minutes. Just fix it. Team, I should put up some pictures of my adorable children, except that they end up on YouTube, so I won't. To motivate you. Today we are starting our sequence on ethics and fairness. There's going to be 3 lectures on this subject. Okay, so I will start by hopefully not being too depressing on this, because I try not to be too depressing, but I want to motivate this subject overall by talking about how much software and software engineers and software engineering influence and can have, frankly, negative effects on individuals and society, right? Don't have to write very much code and can have really widespread effects. Ethics and what is ethical and what is right is a very culturally informed topic. It's a very local topic. If we talk about ethical issues in this class, it tends to be inflected with the United States frame because we talk about legality as well, and that's also where we are. I understand that it's a locale-specific thing. None of your opinions will have any impact on, like, your grade or my opinion of you, right? Like, so, we're not going to have an extensive ethical debate here. I just want you to understand that you can. Don't worry about it, right? We can have an informed discussion about various ethical issues. And I don't want you to feel like if you vote for a certain thing on Slack, it's going to affect your grade anyway. It's not, right? We're just using a number of ethical case studies to frame the discussion. And the disclaimer is, I know that countries besides the United States exist. I promise. That said, there are a number of ways that software can affect the world in negative ways. And a bunch of examples of software going wrong or people doing things that are wrong with software that were bad. I think actually the least interesting example is the Volkswagen emissions situation. Does anyone know anything about this?
They detected when they were being tested for emissions and lowered their emissions for the test.
Right, yeah, so they had their software detect when the Volkswagen was being tested for emissions and then had it lie, right? Or give different outputs so as to cheat emission standards, right? It's a pretty classic example when you're talking about software ethics. I think it's boring because obviously it's bad, right? Maybe you don't think emission standards should exist, fine. But so deliberately making your software lie when you know it's bad to cheat rules is bad. But I think that there are a lot more maybe subtle or interesting corner cases that we can talk about, right? So for example, there's software like sports betting apps or any kind of Instagram kind of situation with an infinite scroll, right? There's a lot of evidence that software can be very addicting. And that optimizing for things like engagement can lead to negative behavior in users and can impact social and mental health, right? There's a whole lot of work about the impact of social media on teenagers' health, for example, that can be very negative. And that to me is a lot less obvious than cheating emission standards, right? Because there are things about social media that are not terrible, right? Optimizing for people enjoying your app is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can have all these negative downstream effects. Just the number of people injured per day due to distracted driving in the US is kind of an interesting problem and related to our sort of technology addiction. But I think there are other angles you can take on this as well, right? Developers make decisions every day, what features they work on, how they work on them, the order in which they work on, what they prioritize, what kind of quality assurance processes they engage in, and when they stop, right? When is the software good enough to ship? So on the one hand, if the Facebook app crashes because there's a bug in it, I think the sun continues to rise. Maybe, in fact, our lives are better. But those decisions can have much more serious implications in safety critical contexts, for example. So I have a couple of examples here from bugs in or related to insulin pump app software. I stuck with it, so it's funny. So the version of the slides I was working from had this, I don't remember even what it was illustrating. I wear an insulin pump, so of course it's a subject near and dear to my heart. This actually is a really boring bug. This bug was basically, it would accidentally cause the battery on the pump to run down, which like, it's not great, but like, it's fine, you plug it in, it charges, the sun continues to rise. This one was really bad. They were both apps, but they were apps for different pumps. And I think this one actually was iPhone specific. This one was Android specific, where if you entered a dosing, you could enter dosing in the app in the phone and it'll beam it to your pump. So if you're wearing like a dress or something, you don't have to like, right? If you left off the leading zero, so if you meant to do 0.5 units of insulin, it would just silently drop the decimal and give you 5 instead. This is really, 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 really bad. This is like, can kill you in an hour bad. And I was actually, maybe I was surprised I didn't get more coverage at the time. It was a catastrophe. But you think like it's a UI bug, right? A fairly minor one, actually, in the grand scheme. And how did they miss it, right? So I'm sure that nobody did it maliciously, right? Like I don't think anyone working on the Android app for the Insulet device wants to kill the diabetics using their apps, right? Like, I don't think there's malice involved. But the point is that the decisions that we make daily about quality assurance and process and testing, right, can have really outside implications depending on the users of the software and the particular ways that it fails. Perhaps slightly more relevant to this class, right? I think machine learning can really amplify and complicate a lot of these conversations because of the way that behavior emerges from data and because of the way that it can in many ways be easier to subvert claims of responsibility. So this one's getting old, but it's just so egregious that like I can't cut it. I'm trying to update some of the examples in the slides, but this was from 2020. And at the time, I haven't been on Twitter in at least a year because it's terrible now, but you would post a picture, right, if you had a big picture like this, and Twitter would automatically decide which part of the picture to focus on in the preview, right? And if you give it this picture or this picture, you would get the same horrible face of Mitch McConnell, right? Now, do I think the Twitter engineers at the time made it so that their machine learning model would pick the horrible white man? On purpose, unlikely, right? Did it happen anyway? Yes, right? And we need to think about sort of the implications of that and of the kinds of software we're building, especially when it's learning from data, and the data is learned from human behavior, which is not always ideal. So we have a lot of power, right, in shaping products and outcomes, and there are serious individual and societal harms that are possible, right? Either from negligence in a lot of cases, and also from actual bad behavior, and also from neither, or inadvertence, or it was the algorithm, we didn't mean to, right? But I think we have responsibility as engineers to think about those implications and what implications they have for the design of our systems. So today we're going to be talking a fair bit about sort of the principles of fairness, the sources of bias, when they're good, when they're bad, and how we should think about them. On Wednesday, we will talk about specifically fairness measures and metrics as they relate to machine learning models, and how we can choose between them. And then next week, Christian will talk about how to design for fairness or system level kind of interventions to build fairer or more responsible systems. So today is actually a lot more sort of conceptual definitional stuff, although we will be talking about ML systems. Wednesday is metrics. Next week is the system level stuff that I actually think is more fun, but I will be on a plane, so you get to learn it from Christian instead. We don't have class next Wednesday, right, Christian? Correct. By the way, we don't have class next Wednesday. We should have opened that. So enjoy. So let's start with some quick definitions terminology. So we distinguish between what's legal and what's ethical. Legal means in accordance to laws, right? There are rules that govern society set by the government. We are punished if we are violated them. Ethical things are things that follow moral principles of tradition, of a group or a set of individuals, sort of a branch of philosophy or of standard human conduct. We have a subset of these called professional ethics that tend to be codified by professional organizations like the ACM or IEEE, which do have rules of ethics for engineering or responsible engineering. There's no legal binding to these, right? They're separate. But as a company, it can be nice to have high ethical standards. It may be beneficial, yield long-term benefits, right? Through, let's say, staff loyalty. People might like working for a company they perceive as ethical, right? I'm actually, not being a philosophy or ethics professor, I'm not particularly invested in convincing those of you who don't care about ethics to care about ethics for their own purpose. That's not the kind of professor I am. But it might be possible to convince you that it's worth caring about in terms of the market or succeeding in life. So, either way, we should talk about these concepts. Something can be legal and be totally unethical, right? These things exist. So this guy is a guy named Martin Scarelli, and he's so odious, I'm still talking about him 10 years later. He basically obtained the manufacturing license for a drug and raised its price from $13.5 to $750 per pill because he could. Right? Because he could. It was totally legal. But there was widespread criticism, an attempt to shame this man, didn't work very well, right? Because we viewed sort of collectively that the behavior was pretty odious, right? You can be unethical while still being legal. You can be illegal and ethical. There's plenty of that, right? There are plenty of laws that are viewed as unethical and people can righteously resist them. And you can be ethical and legal and so on. It's not that they're completely unrelated. One hopes that law and ethics coincide, but one does not necessarily imply the other. I did give you a little bit of this already. What is ethical is very complicated. In general, I will talk some about EU regulations because they're actually saying some, so it's worth knowing about what they are. And also because global regulations do impact companies even operating in other countries, because if you want to operate in Europe, you have to care about GDPR. I apologize for the US-centric perspective, but in general, it's worth being aware of kind of the global situation because we're citizens of humanity, and because software reaches globally. Okay. We are going to talk a little bit, just to think a bit, about responsibility when it comes to software. And there'll be a couple of Slack debates here. So accountability, responsibility, liability all overlap. And they're usually about assigning blame, right? So who is responsible for fixing or who is liable for something. When we use liability or culpability, that usually has a legal connotation, right? Whereas responsibility tends to define ethical kind of goals, right? Regardless of who is actually legally required to pay for something. Accountability is then often defined as an oversight relationship, right? Where someone is accountable to some kind of higher power that can assign penalties. So here I'm distinguishing a little bit between, again, our legal versus our ethical definitions here, right? Like who is responsible for something isn't necessarily the person legally obliged to pay for it, right? But here we're kind of talking about a little bit of both. So accountability implies some oversight with the ability to penalize, connecting a little bit back to that legal definition. Now, in general, and certainly in the US, it's very easy to blame the algorithm, the data, or the software. We've had examples of this so far. Bugs happen, there's nothing we could have done. And I think one of the takeaways, hopefully, from this lecture is that, humans both design and execute and fail to anticipate and use software, sold software to each other. We want to think a little bit about who is accountable and responsible for various things, and use that to guide our thinking in approaching responsible engineering. All that said, mostly software engineers are not liable. This is from the MIT license. For the most part, software is declared with licenses that excuse the engineers of it from liability. This tends to hold up in court, although except apparently not this week when it comes to addictive software, which is kind of interesting. The VW case is kind of an exception that I think sort of proves the rule, right? People have gotten jail time and fines for the VW case, various managers, both in the US and in Germany, but it is a pretty rare thing. So, if you explicitly cheat emission standards and lie about it on purpose and know that you're telling people to do that, and then you get caught, you can actually go to jail for that. But that's about as egregious as it has to be, which is why I think it's not that interesting a discussion when it comes to software ethics. Okay. So there are lots of ways that AI can go wrong, right? AI has specific failure modes that we've talked about. We talked about some of them already today. Bugs can happen in software that are very dangerous. Software can discriminate based on all kinds of things. Machine learning has lots of implications like that. This class is full of case studies of machine learning-enabled systems doing stupid things, okay? So I want to do a quick vote on Slack. Who is primarily responsible for considering the ramifications of our AI or an AI-enabled systems or the AI models themselves and so on? I'm curious your opinion about this, and so I'm just going to say there's going to be a vote on Slack, just like vote. I will not look at what you voted at because I don't care. I would just want to look at numbers because I'm curious. It's kind of interesting to me that the people who create the actual AI models are losing to the developers who create applications that use AI in this vote by a fair margin, which I don't know that I disagree. I actually went out of my way to not formulate a strong opinion on this ahead of time. But it's an interesting sort of spread, I think.
I have a very strong opinion.
Oh, I really want to know what's your really strong opinion.
The first one doesn't make sense. The second one is the only one that's useful because it's application developers who have any control over interactions with the environment where errors actually occur.
So I think I'm inclined to agree with you, but I don't really like absolving the people who make the models completely from the patterns that are learned from the data that they train on. Yes?
I personally agree, but I believe developers do not have the tools to understand how complex society works. And I think it's not a matter of 1, 2, 3, but rather a combination probably of 3 and number 2. And even more people that should be involved into how can we develop tools that actually enhance humanity.
So the problem is that we're not equipped as developers to actually build fair or ethical systems. We don't know how to use them. So does that mean we are absolved? No. Okay, I see a lot of head shakes. Okay, so then what, I guess? Well, I suppose that's the question. It's interesting. I also would primarily responsible. Primarily is a very load-bearing word in this title, though, because I think it's possible for multiple entities to be responsible. There is what's other interesting thing about this survey was from 2018. And I wonder if they redid it now. No, if the answers would be different. If they were to, if the answers would change. I know they haven't, but I wonder if the answers would change now. Because, I don't know. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this a little bit. There are 2 examples I thought was kind of interesting. So, anyone know what FaceSwap is? I should hope you know what FaceSwap is. Maybe you don't. What's FaceSwap?
To swap faces?
Yeah, basically. It was one of the first, maybe the first, widely released open source deepfakes kind of software. So the idea was it would let you swap faces in pictures and videos, right? So it was a way to make sort of deepfakes. What led to the banning of the subreddit on deepfakes, okay? Now, immediately, this software is released and people start doing horrible things with it, right? Because people are horrible. It was created by a person who had a particular goal in mind, and that was to create non-consensual pornography. That was the reason the software was created. It has been taken over by different people who don't believe in the bad use, right? And have a big sort of discussion, the README, about the ethical issues of FaceSwap, right? And what I think is interesting about this README is they're kind of telling on themselves, right? But as is so often the way with new technology, it was immediately used to create inappropriate content. at the same time, I mean, and this is true, right? It was the first AI code that anyone could use to experiment with without having a PhD in math, right? And now you can do kind of interesting things. It was a fantastic learning opportunity, right? So, I mean, the argument they're making is that, well, you know, people are doing horrible things, but we're not using it to do horrible things. We think it should be viewed as an educational opportunity, and it is not for creating inappropriate content. It is not for changing faces without consent, right? It is not to be used unethically. Okay, so I think they're telling on themselves a little bit. I think my question I have for myself is, you know, can you inherit a harmful tool and redeem it via disclaimer? Right, which is effectively what they've done or tried to do, is say, look, this is an interesting educational thing. It has positive uses. The fact that it was created for bad uses, you know, that's not on us. This argument about deepfakes continues. So in October, OpenAI released something called Sora text to video. And it shipped explicitly with certain guardrails, like engineering guardrails in place. It wasn't supposed to be used to create videos naming with certain named public figures. And the videos were nominally watermarked in some way, so you should be able to know that they were created by AI. This says generated by AI because it was a screen cap in a New York Times article, and they labeled it that way. That's not how it came out of Sora. Turns out it was pretty easy to remove the watermark. And of course, it was immediately used for all kinds of bad things, right? All kinds of disinformation. People created videos of individuals stuffing ballot boxes at the polls to create disinformation in the news. All sorts of copyright abuse that wasn't covered by the guardrails. Of course, people started, you know, creating new cartoons out of it, reusing intellectual property, right? Like all this stuff that I think seems obvious in retrospect. And there's also a higher level ethical societal concern around the widespread deployment of this kind of technology, that it erodes kind of societal trust in one another and in the news and in what you can read, right? So there's sort of the immediate harm of what kinds of harms did you get immediately from abusing IP, from creating videos of people without their consent, and so on. And then there's the higher level harm of, you know, a technology that intrinsically creates video that looks real and erodes societal trust. Now, I wanted to talk about it, at least in contrast with the FaceSwap thing. Worth pointing out, they literally just announced that they're shutting down Sora in like 2 weeks because it's hemorrhaging money. It's like $1 million a day. It's bleeding money. So they're shutting it down. The market voted. But I thought the contrast was a little bit interesting, right? Because the original creator of FaceSwap had a negative intention, is no longer really the primary kind of moral authority over it. The current developers claim that it's intended for educational use and should not be used for these unethical things. But of course, it still can be. This was created with a purely kind of neutral commercial intention. They tried to engineer guardrails in. They clearly thought about it at least a little bit, but those mitigations were totally inadequate on any number of levels. I also think it's a bit telling that this was released a number of years later, right? And so they should have already been able to see what was going to happen with deepfakes. And I think that the harms were totally foreseeable in both cases if you think about it for 2 seconds. Anyway, I wanted a new vote about the opinion, about the level of responsibility here, and who is accountable, right? Who's problematic. So Christian, do you have a strong opinion on this one? I didn't pitch it to you ahead of time.
All bad.
It's all bad. So FaceSwap is losing in the great, in the problematic wars, in that the original intention was bad, right? And at least OpenAI made an effort. It's not like it's not running away with it, right? Like but I actually think it's maybe. I'm trying to decide if it's closer. No, so 1 and 3 are pretty close right now. We're like 30 votes for 1 and 38 votes for 3, which I think is kind of interesting because I actually have a hard time letting OpenAI off the hook on this one because they have so much money. I mean, it's fake money, but they have so much money, and they already knew what people would do with FaceSwap because people already did it. So I'm not. I tend to come down at 1 myself, but I'm interested. Those of you who think it does make a difference versus it doesn't.
I mean, Sora is obviously more user-facing product versus FaceSwap, and because FaceSwap was, although it was an open source, we know it was kind of like setting a high barrier for those who can use it, but Sora is like, you just tell what kind of video you would like to have, and OpenAI will return for it. So basically anyone who could get access to it, so they have like a stronger ability, or like at least a bigger responsibility to prevent the generation of misinformation. And also they have the history of FaceSwap, so they should have come up with better strategies on how to mitigate those misinformation.
So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the argument that OpenAI has much more reach, right, than an open source project. Has a much higher barrier to entry. Like you don't need a PhD in computer science to use it, but you need to know something about how to use open source software to use it, and that's already cutting out a huge proportion of the Earth's population. Whereas by contrast, OpenAI was explicitly making a consumer-facing product, right? I don't see anyone else voting for or arguing in the comments for increased regulation, for example, which I think is sort of interesting. Although there were a couple of something else's, and then a bunch of acknowledgments. So anyone want to argue for something else? I mean, I guess I'm not sure where we end up, right? Should we just not do this? Like,
do you think big companies such as OpenAI influencing regulations? Like, does it really, let's be honest, I think money does make a say
Oh, yeah.
to this, but how strong is it today?
So we are going to talk about regulations, actually. Might as well just okay. I'll tell you, listen. Incentive-wise, you're anticipating me. Right, you're anticipating me, right? Like, now on the one hand, like the market killed Sora, so maybe everything is fine, right? Like, maybe it's fine. Like, responsible engineering takes time, it costs money, the incentives here are relatively low. It's almost like security, right? Like if you're having this problem, you're already winning because you have too many users. So from a corporate perspective, maybe the incentives are relatively low, and often companies can apologize and react or undo the bad thing, and that usually works just fine. In general, companies do tend to externalize risk. We'll get to regulations in a second, right? So incentive-wise, there are tons of challenges that interfere with the ability to engineer responsibly and ethically. I don't think there's a single answer on all of this, by the way. Like, I also don't think there's a single entity that's culpable for any of this, and that's not really what I think the class is arguing. It's more that it's helpful to give you a framework to think about accountability and ethics and fairness in the systems you're building, and to recognize some of the challenges, right? In general, there are financial incentives that tend to dominate other goals because companies operate under capitalism. There's very little regulation, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. And policymakers have very poor understanding or very shallow understanding of technical systems and of socio-technical systems and the way that the two interact. There are also a number of engineering challenges at the system and the machine learning level, and we will be talking about a number of these. So the point is that these problems have existed for a long time, but machine learning, I think, exacerbates a lot of them, especially given how widespread these systems now are. And there are a number of machine learning specific techniques and concerns that we'll be talking about, and that's the point of these 3 lectures. Well, let's get to regulations because you, again, anticipated me. Okay. So there is to some extent there have been some historical examples of companies broadly and proudly announcing that they do not want to allow their technology to be used in certain ways. I'm a little bit of a cynic. It's largely for marketing. There's a very recent dust-up between Anthropic and the Defense Department, right? Maybe it comes from genuine ethical concerns on the part of Anthropic's leadership. I don't know. This does happen sometimes. Companies will sometimes do this. Virtually every company has something like this on a web page somewhere. So this is Microsoft's. 6 principles we believe should guide AI development and use: fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. So people should be accountable for AI systems. which I think is kind of interesting, especially as we're talking about accountability in this class, that we should create oversight so that humans can be accountable and in control, and that somebody can be, I guess, viewed as responsible for the things the systems do. And we're seeing this a little bit when it comes to code generation, right? That in general, code generated by AI is still considered the responsibility of some software engineer who created it, right? And to whatever extent that US regulatory frameworks are thinking about it, they are still ascribing responsibility and ownership of the code to the engineer who prompted the model, and not the model per se, and not to no one. Basically, companies have a strong incentive to declare themselves perfectly good at regulating themselves, to avoid maximally, as much as possible, governmental regulation, right? So there's, I think, a fairly important point made back in 2019, which is still true, where big tech is, at the time, was beginning to talk about, ethical AI and fairness in fairly grandiose ways. And the argument being made by OKGame here is that the discourse of ethical AI is basically a Silicon Valley effort to avoid legally enforceable restrictions of controversial techniques. And I think, it makes sense from a commercial perspective, right? Even if you are a person who cares about accountability or ethics, to avoid having to deal with onerous regulations is not an insane thing under capitalism. So that led, actually, there was a whole bunch of discourse at the time about the concerns of safety. And there was a lot more, I think, hype on the internet about how AGI was going to happen and kill us all, and we had to worry about all that, which was leading to things like this broad proclamation in 2020, this is the year of AI regulations. This was not the year of AI regulation. There have been some policy efforts. I'm going to skip most of them, actually, because starting in 2019, right, in general, the principles behind government regulation, actually sort of regardless of administration, has been that the government should, for the most part, not try to regulate AI too much. This shifted a little bit. There were a couple of executive orders under the Biden administration that attempted to impose some standards and regulatory sort of frameworks and movements that were immediately undone once Biden was no longer president. So it's not necessarily worth talking about too much. The current standard on AI from the United States, sort of the government's perspective on this, is basically to not regulate it and instead try and use it everywhere, including the Department of Defense, unless it's Anthropic, at which point they won't. So the goal is to basically dismantle as much regulation as possible. That's what's going on around here. On the other hand, the EU does have, we talked about this already, anybody remember when? Not in this much detail, but I did talk about the AI regulation on the subject. We discussed GDPR, right? And we were talking about, I think it was around safety. Christian wasn't here, so whatever lecture you weren't here for. We talked about GDPR, and we did also talk about the EU AI Act, which is still in the process of being rolled out, right? So it's a sort of staged set of regulations. And it's a framework that is based on risk, and that's the part I didn't talk about too much last time. There's different levels of risk that they sort of taxonomize systems by. Unacceptable risk that it bans a certain numbers of applications. I did mention this when we talked about it. They banned applications for social scoring, cognitive manipulation, or real-time biometric surveillance. They call high-risk things like data governance monitoring. Human oversight is very important. Accuracy of applications for hiring, health, and law enforcement. A lot of the sort of classic examples where fairness matters are considered high risk. Limited risk imposes sort of limited transparency obligations, so things like image generation. That's not a very risky kind of use case, so they're just required to say, hey, look, a model's being used here, versus minimal risk, things that basically aren't regulated at all, so spam filters don't have to disclose that they're using ML, video games, and so on. So it's primarily kind of related to regulating product liability. There are some concerns about the degree or extent to which it might hinder innovation in Europe. There's not too much to say about it yet because it's still being created in terms of concrete implementation. Like I said, it's being rolled out right now. But it is influencing discourse on how we talk about regulating AI, not just in the EU. And so I think it's worth being aware of it because it's going to continue doing that and influencing that as sort of time passes and you go off into your careers. So it's a little annoying from my perspective as a person teaching it to be like, hey, it's a thing, but not a very interesting one yet. Christian.
The product liability thing back to earlier means that the application developers, not the model developers, are liable.
Yeah.
So they made, in my point, the right view.
Yes.
A lot of people disagree with that. There's an exception for large language models, where they actually try to regulate models. And that's also very controversial.
I can see that. I'm not disagreeing with you, Christian. I enjoy when you have strong opinions. And I tend to see, multiple sides of things. So it doesn't really get to it gets to your question. The question was, what's the incentives that corporations have to self-regulate? Like, what about regulations, blah, blah, blah. Answer is they don't unless they are run by people who have particular, ethical frameworks. And some not everybody's terrible. There aren't that many regulations in the world. The ones that do exist are kind of in Europe. They're still being rolled out. There was sort of a half-hearted attempt in the US that then immediately died. And so, that's where we're at. And this is why Christian thinks the accountability part of this lecture is depressing. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. So instead, we'll talk about fairness. On that cheerful note. Okay. So fairness is a really complicated subject. Just like it's an instance of ethics in general and of accountability in general. We're going to touch on things mostly focusing on things related to machine learning, right? Because we can't talk about everything because it's 2.5 lectures, right? So fairness asks questions about how to treat people and whether treating different groups of people differently is ethical. So if two groups of people are systematically treated differently, it's often considered unfair, okay? Which maybe begins to hint at why we're going to spend a lot of time on it talking about fairness in a class about machine learning, because often models are used to make decisions or treat people in certain ways, and we need to know whether and when that's fair. So I would be curious, let's do this one too. Imagine I bring a pie to class. Hopefully I didn't bake it, I'm a terrible baker. So how should we divide it up? Should we have equal slices for everybody? Okay. Should we have bigger slices for either the people who contributed to the baking or bakers in general? Should we have bigger slices for, let's say, the children? Okay. Should we have bigger slices for hungry people? Or should we have more pie for everyone, bake more? I think that this is a cop-out answer, by the way, so you're welcome to vote for it, but not that it's a cop-out answer. Obviously, 5, more pie, right? So do a vote on Slack. Seize the ovens and the means of production. Pretty even, okay, so obviously more pie is winning. Okay, obviously more pie is winning. We stipulate that more pie is winning. If we ignore more pie, we have a pretty even-ish split between equal slices for everybody and bigger slices for hungry people, with bigger slices for hungry people slightly winning. So someone defend your choice to me. Why is that more fair? We're advocating for treating people differently, so why is that okay? The goal of the pie is to feed hungry people. So it should scale with the amount of hunger. So that's a defense for feeding the hungry people more.
The word use was fairness. And
Yeah.
to me, fairness is equally split. Giving more pie to hungry people would be more like injustice.
Okay, so we're distinguishing between fairness and something else, right? Which is something that we will do very shortly. So you're anticipating my slides, which I love. So I think we're getting down a little bit to sort of the semantics. What do we mean by fair, right? Which is sort of why I was asking. But I think it's interesting the extent to which, even in sort of a straightforward question about pi, right, we can disagree about that, right? Like, what's the point of pi? I might say, you know, pi in class is actually probably not intended to feed the hungry, right? It's maybe intended as a treat, so that maybe everyone should get an equal slice. But if someone is hungrier, then maybe they should get more, you know? If your blood sugar is low, you get pi first. Christian, what's your feeling about the pi?
Yes.
I know the obvious answer, but what's your, like, if I do not allow you to have the obvious answer, you don't eat pie, it's not vegan. Okay.
We should get more people into baking, right?
Should get more people into baking. Okay, so the goal is we should feed the experienced bakers more to incentivize people to learn to bake, to make, so that we have more pie because more people are baking. I think that.
But sure.
Okay, so there are rules, actually there are laws about this, turns out, even in the US. There are regulated domains that dictate where and how and under what circumstances you can treat different people differently versus when you have to treat them the same. Often related to credit scoring, education, employment, housing, and public accommodation. It does extend to marketing and advertising. And it's not limited only to like necessarily the final decision made in any of these things, right? But also the decision-making process. So there are a number of legally protected classes in the United States. Things you are not allowed to discriminate, you can't treat people differently based on. Things like race, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, age, pregnancy, familial status, disability status. American with Disabilities Act was originally a Nixon law, so I think 1990s may be wrong, but veteran status and genetic information, right? So these are things you cannot discriminate against people when it comes to in the United States, okay? We will come back to this because I wanted to get here, because you were talking about pi, right? We often actually decompose fairness into a number of sort of different related concerns, and a lot of the fairness discussions that are challenging come down to unequal starting points of people, right, where they start, or disagreements about what we are actually talking about. And we tend to distinguish between equity, so those would be tools that identify and address inequality. So maybe have a taller ladder for a shorter person so that they're at the same level, they can access an equal amount of apples. Versus equality, where you have evenly distributed tools and assistance, so the same size ladder, regardless of the height of the child. Versus justice, which aims to fix the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. And most of, I think, the breakdowns and conversations about things like pi relate to how you're thinking about this, right? What, are you caring about equality of opportunity? Are you caring about equality of outcome? Are you caring about equality of access to the tools versus the outcome, and so on? Caveat, something can be fair and still unethical. Is this movie too old for this reference to land? It's not too old for this reference to land. Good. For those of you who are unfamiliar, am I going to ruin the movie? No, the movie's really old. I'm allowed to spoil it. Thanos is trying to save the universe. There are too many people, so he's going to snap his fingers, and what is it, 50% of individuals will die, disapparate, stop existing, okay? It's fair. And then everybody has like an even coin flip, right? That doesn't make it ethical per se. Moving on, because it's not that interesting a debate. Not all discrimination is harmful, and not all discrimination is illegal. Okay, so in loans, for example, in lending, gender discrimination is illegal. You can't discriminate against giving somebody a loan based on their gender identity. Okay, if that's not allowed. In medicine, actually, gender specificity is often permitted. It's often desirable, right? Knowing somebody's gender can influence knowing something or being able to predict something about their medical outcomes, right? Same diseases represent differently in people born female versus people born male. People born female have higher incidences of certain diseases. People born male have higher incidences of other diseases, right? Like, discrimination in medicine is often okay. And in fact, women generally pay less for life insurance than men as a result. So not all discrimination is harmful, and it's not all illegal, right? And discrimination and fairness is a domain-specific model. Machine learning models must discriminate based on input data, right? That's literally what they do. Right? They're taking input data and they're producing output, and there's some kind of discrimination happening. That's like literally the point. If there are real differences between two groups, it might not be fair to ignore them. The problem is what we would think about as unjustified differentiation, so discriminating on factors that we collectively have decided should not matter. Some of those things are dictated by law, and some of them are dictated by norms. Okay? So when we're talking about fairness, like what is fairness versus justice, right? It's best understood as a societal or cultural concept. And I'm going to distinguish here between that and bias when we discuss machine learning, because that's a technological or algorithmic concept, although it's often discussed in terms of its negative effects. So we expect there to be bias, right? Because it's an algorithm, it's categorizing things. But whether bias is harmful or unfair is not a technical concept, right? It's not something you can decide algorithmically. So when we're trying to figure out what bias is, or whether bias is bad, or if there's sort of problematic algorithmic bias, a definition I find useful is that it's a skew that produces some type of harm, right? We expect there to be skew in machine learning. We have learned to discriminate based on data. The question is that skew bad? So that's the framing we're going to take in discussing it. So is it bad? There are two types of harms that we will discuss in this framing. There are harms that we call harms of allocation. So those are harms where opportunities or resources are withheld, right? So if a machine learning model is biased in that it, systematically excludes women from receiving loans, that is withholding loans or resources from a group of people, right? That would be a harm to them of allocation. A harm of representation is a bit more nebulous. It's something that reinforces stereotypes or reinforces subordination along the lines of identity. So a harm of allocation, I just gave you an example. There are a number of examples here, especially in sort of the late 2010s of models that would discriminate pretty explicitly on race and gender when it comes to image recognition, right? There was a lot of the discourse there was around the gender shades work, which is actually really interesting and still worth reading, right? But it leads to degraded quality of service or degraded user experience for certain groups, right? Or withholding opportunities or resources. Harms of representation can lead to things like underrepresentation of certain groups in organizations, right? Or reinforcement of stereotypes. So, for example, as work for, it's quite old, discrimination in online ad delivery, right? Racially identifying names change the ads that you get on the internet, right? That's reinforcing conceptions based on something related to identity. It's not necessarily withholding a loan, for example, right? But it's reinforcing stereotypes. So if we think about, where's McConnell, right? This is more a harm of representation rather than a harm of allocation, right? Nobody is withheld access to some opportunity because of a model discriminating based on facial color. But it is reifying discrimination or reifying things related to identity in society, and that harm is maybe wider spread, even if it's harder to specifically identify a particularly harmed person. There are lots of examples I could go through here. There are lots of examples. Actually like hid a bunch of slides with a bunch of examples because it just felt like a laundry list of depression, right? It's also worth noting that I'm talking about harms along particular axes, and of course identity is intersectional. I'm sorry for talking about it as though it's not. I know that it is. Point is that there are multiple types of harms. Harms can intersect. Products can cause both harms of allocation and harms of representation. Think about your system objectives and identify potential harms along multiple axes. We already know how to do that because we've been talking about risk all semester. Okay. Now, bias, I just defined it a couple slides ago, right? Skew that produces a type of harm. So a skew that leads to something bad. Where does it come from? Sources of bias. Where does it come from? This example is now pretty old, and it's been fixed in a way that's kind of interesting. This was Google Translate as of about 10 years ago. Would do this thing where if you translated, I think this is to Turkish, from English, he is a nurse, she is a doctor, to Turkish, and then translated back. It would do the wrong thing. It would systematically do this thing with the gender, right? It would always assume that the nurse was female, that the doctor was male. This example of nurse versus doctor has come up a billion times in so many different systems, right? Even image recognition systems would reliably label somebody with a stethoscope. If they were a male-looking person, it would be a doctor versus, if it was a woman, it would be a nurse. I mean, this is like very common. This was also true in Microsoft's translation at the time. This is now fixed, okay? So like, I don't want to yell at Google too much. It's just a sort of classic example of a type of bias. Let's see, I wanted to jump ahead to the slide that shows how this was fixed because I think it's interesting. We will come back to it, but I'll figure out where that slide is. So the way they fixed it, I think, they actually tried a bunch of different things, but they didn't fix it in the model. Right, the model itself, they keep updating the model or whatever, but like, it's a sort of outside the model thing where they have tried to correct for it using effectively systematic, outside the model kind of interventions here. So popping up effectively, translations are gender specific, right? So pick the gender that you intend. Because if you're translating between a gendered language and a not gendered language, right, this comes up. And what is intended, the model can't guess. And so instead of trying to make the model guess, which causes it to reify sort of assumptions about who is a doctor versus who isn't a doctor, right? These outside the models kind of interventions can help us address that instead. Bias can come from a bunch of places. And that's the point of the last 20 minutes of the lecture is what are the sources of bias? Historical bias, I will go through them. I will not read them and then go through them. So I'll just go through them. These were taxonomized in 2016. There's no reason to update them, right? They're just kind of like, it's a good taxonomy, so we're going to go with it. So one source of bias is what we call historical bias. Data reflects past biases, not necessarily intended outcomes. So, an example, this was a 2018 image search, right? So if you searched for CEOs, you searched for pictures of CEOs on the internet, you got a bunch of dudes who looked like this, okay? I bet this is still true. I did not correct this. And one reason is that less than 5% of Fortune 500 companies have people who identify as women as their CEO. So if you're searching for a CEO, the pictures you're going to get of CEOs are going to be a bunch of dudes who look like this, because this is what the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies look like, okay? Now, if you're trying to build a model that will produce images of CEOs, stock images of CEOs, right? There's a question here that if you're training on past data of CEOs, right, this is the data you're getting. That leads to a certain skew in the data, right? That's what we call a historical bias. The data reflects what was going on previously. So the question is, to what extent, and I don't have a solid answer here, right? But if I'm going to be generating images of CEOs, should the algorithm reflect historical reality or aspirational reality? And there's been significant debate about this, right? Which one it should do, which one it should be, right? There's also a question about what reality is. So if you search for the word gamer as of a few years ago, if you wanted a picture of a gamer, most of the pictures you get are of dudes, even though women actually play more games than men as a market. Tend to play more casual mobile games on phones, right? So maybe not the classic kind of idea of a gamer in a big gamer rig, right? But when it comes to like market-wise, more women play games. So if I'm searching for gamer, right, the reality is a certain kind of person. But if I'm searching for an image of a traditional gamer, what am I actually looking for, right? So it's sort of a question of like, should it be accurate with respect to what the person's searching for? Should it be accurate to reality? Should it be accurate to history, right? I'm not actually sure. But the point is, it's not as simple as to say, well, okay, like, we should just make things reflective of reality versus not. Christian.
I see a bunch of people doing image search for CEO. If you do that, compare Bing versus Google versus DuckDuckGo or others.
Are there one of your answers?
Yes.
I love this. Hold on, I'm gonna do it. I'm doing it right now. I didn't do this morning, I should have.
And intentionally so.
I'm sorry, I'm doing this live. I realize you can all also do this live, and you don't need me to do it in front of you, but I'm doing it live anyway. Okay, here's DuckDuckGo. Okay. I'm working on it. All right, I gotta make them fit on the thing. I watched when Tim Nick Gabriel came to CMU in 2020, or gave a talk. I guess it must have been remote because of the times. I was watching it with a non-technical friend who was Googling images was doing this in the background, like while she was speaking. It was interesting. Okay. So let's stop it. This is Bing. What are you seeing distributionally? So these are all men, but racially diverse-ish men. There's the occasional lady in here. So which one do you think is the best, Christian, since you've presumably done this with more forethought than I did? I don't know, I'm asking you.
So Google specifically addressed it, right? So the first, if you go up to the top, there are multiple women in the very first image.
Yeah. I don't know how organic that one is.
And this hasn't changed in a while.
That's true. They clearly are doing it on purpose.
Go back to slide 77.
This one?
We had the lower quote. This was a study that was done at Microsoft.
That's interesting. So they knew that but didn't make the connection. So is that why the image search folks at Microsoft have so many white dudes?
That's what I assume. I assume they made intentionally different decisions of whether to modify the search to reflect what we want reality to be versus what reality is.
So that's an interesting one. So okay, that is historical bias, and the question is, historical bias influences the data distribution that we're training on, right? And the question is, do we want our models to reflect historical reality or reflect aspirational reality, right? That is not a technical question, right? That's a question of your aspiration in building the model, and Christian doesn't think that those people should be held responsible for the harms of AI, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree.
It's embedding the product.
Sure. Can you think about Google search as a product without, okay, so then maybe I'll argue and say that there is no meaningful distinction between the people building the model and the product, right? Because when it comes to search, search is search.
Although a lot of this is done these days by prompt adjustment, right? Google had this big scandal around image generation in the early days.
Yes.
Where the German Second World soldiers were suddenly very diverse.
Oh yeah, no, I can stop on that.
Right?
In terms of correcting it.
But I think it's a similar strategy, right? Do we want to you represent the world as it maybe should be or as it is?
Yeah, no, we've got that somewhere. Where do we have this? I had it. I do not remember cutting this. Yeah. It's okay. I will say a couple of things though first. I was going to get to tainted labels. It's 76. Okay, so there is an extent to which Google, this is relatively recent. This is Gemini, asked to produce an illustration of a 1943 German soldier. They sort of overcorrected a little bit, maybe, since I don't know how many people like this were fighting for Germany in 1943. So there is definitely a question here in product design, right? To what extent do you want to correct historical bias or not? And there are clear differences in what companies are doing in terms of their posture on the subject and what you should do based on the product that you're building. That's one source of bias. It's the bias of the data you're training on. I will say, though, that we're talking a lot about things like image generation here. Maybe it was 1990. Medical companies were not required to enroll women of childbearing age in pharmaceutical studies until I want to say 1990, early 90s, right? Which means that if you're training on decades of historical medical data, you're missing an awful lot, right? So it's not just the case that we end up learning biases from things like what happened in history versus didn't, but you also need to account for things like sample skew, right? And correct for bias in those cases as well, right? The data is the data, and there are times that it's worth correcting for them. A second source of bias, that's historical bias, are tainted labels. So bias in dataset labels that were assigned either directly or indirectly by humans. This is largely what led to the scrapping of Amazon's internal AI recruiting tool back in 2018 because it was basically penalizing women's applications. This problem has not gone away with Gen AI, right? Because annotators in RLHF are defining what a good LLM response is, right? So humans are still annotating things. And LLM behavior can change based on things like racial cues, whether they're implied or explicit. There's quite a bit of, this is one reference, I have another reference at the end about this, about LLM performance varying based on all kinds of things when it comes to race. So the problem doesn't go away even if we're not explicitly categorizing things or when we're using an LLM to categorize, right? And especially because reinforcement learning mechanisms these days include human annotation to improve the data, right? Tainted labels leading to downstream harm or downstream bias is still a pretty prevalent issue. A third source of bias are what we might call limited features. So features that are less informative or reliable for certain subpopulations. So, for example, graduate admissions, right? We like to look at international applications. We get a lot of them, and we look at letters of recommendation for all applicants. And they may be very, very useful for certain applicants, right? And maybe less informative for others. So students who come from different universities in different parts of the world, there are different norms for what recommendation letters should contain. And they maybe are less informative for students from certain countries, for example. There are all sorts of other examples like this, right? Large language models still process non-standard dialects less accurately on standard natural language understanding tasks because for certain subsets of the population, certain features are less predictive. I forget what number I'm on, 3 or 4. Skewed samples. There's bias in what and in how and what data is collected. And I think it's an important point to say here, raw data is basically an oxymoron, right? So if you think about something like crime prediction, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to collect all of the data about crimes committed in the city, and I'm going to use all of it, right? It's comprehensive. But that ignores the fact that, okay, what is considered a crime in this place, and how is crime policed in a particular city, right? Maybe there are more police units in one place versus another. Maybe there are predictive policing things already in play that are causing police to make certain decisions about where they're going to investigate crime or respond to calls, right? Even fully comprehensive crime predictive data that you're going to build a model on is informed in some sense by some kind of skew, right? That then influences how and what that data ends up looking like. That's true of language models in Gen AI too, right? They train on the internet. That's not a representative sample of humanity. right? And a lot of, I mean, a huge proportion of certainly the early LLMs were trained like on Reddit, which is horrifying, right? And I say this as like, I love Reddit, but also I don't want to use a thing that is trained about how humans interact based on Reddit, right? So being trained on the entire internet is enforcing in its own, like in the data collection, right, a certain kind of skew that can then lead to downstream bias in terms of who the product is serving, right? It's going to be more effective for certain members of humanity who have access to the internet and interact with it, probably in English, in a certain way. Or if you're collecting all medical trial data since the 1950s, right, there's a skewed sample there. Sample size disparity. There's often limited training data for certain subpopulations. So this can, be a result of a biased sampling process that can lead to downstream harm. The Shirley card was used for codec color calibration to calibrate the colors on the cameras, and it used mostly Caucasian models. Or just small subpopulations, right? There are some populations that are a small minority in the United States that end up barely represented in a random sample of the population. And that can mean that if something is, more or less predictive for that population, they can end up influenced in the predictions that the model ends up producing. Without intervention, models will be biased towards the better represented populations, or towards populations that are easier to sample, and may ignore small minority populations as noise. That typically it requires things like deliberate sampling or intentional oversampling, something we've talked about in the past in this class. I'm going fast so that we can have 5 minutes for breakout, because I think I only have one more. No, I have two. I have one more. Final source of bias worth talking about is proxies. So these are features that correlate with some protected attribute but remain after removal. A good example is neighborhood as a proxy for race, or extracurricular activities as a proxy for gender and social class. So that'll be something that can come up in, for example, college admissions, not to spoil the breakout. But, certain extracurricular activities are strongly associated with gender, social class, or race in this country. And so even if you're not looking at race and predicting something like college admissions, if you know that somebody rode crew, you can make a strong prediction about that person's background. So, having spoiled the ending, here's our breakout for the day, 6 minutes. We're going to do it fast. Imagine we want to build a model, or we want to build a system based around a model that evaluates college applications and identifies students most likely to succeed. We are taking as input the application materials, GPA, transcript, test scores, personal essays, letters of recommendation, demographic information, and so on. Identify the possible harms and the sources of bias. Right? And by sources of bias, I don't mean, I'm being actually like specific, right? There were sources of bias that I listed, like these words should appear in your answer, okay? What kind of bias are you talking about concretely? Go, go, go. So what we're going to do is we'll finish the discussion and post to Slack, and then we will have the conversation about it on Wednesday, just so it's not too rushed. And I think it fits really nicely into Wednesday's content anyway. So keep talking for 2 more minutes, and then we will wrap up class.